This is not a story about something being hidden. It is a story about how something gets cleaned. There comes a point in a county like this where you realize failure is not always a career-ending event. Sometimes it is a branding challenge. That is what I mean by the shine machine. You will not find it in the bylaws. Nobody puts it on a campaign sign. There is no public office called Director of Reputation Laundering. But the machine is real all the same. It works socially, quietly, through favors, flattery, photo ops, carefully timed amnesia, and the small local miracle of people who can leave one bad room and still show up 6 months later under good lighting, wearing a fresh title and a cleaner biography. People think corruption always looks dirty. The durable kind usually looks polished. That is the trick. If money laundering is what happens when dirty cash gets run through enough businesses that it comes out looking clean on paper, reputation laundering is what happens when dirty history gets run through enough boards, nonprofits, advisory committees, chamber events, ribbon cuttings, prayer breakfasts, gala sponsorships, magazine spreads, awards luncheons, and smiling profile pieces that it comes out looking like character. And once character is packaged correctly, it becomes easier to sell than truth. That is how the same names keep climbing. That is how a person can leave one mess and reappear on a panel about leadership. That is how an institution can stumble through debt, silence, neglect, or public failure and still get treated in the next round of messaging like a pillar of community partnership. That is how the county solves two problems at once. First, it protects the people who know where the favors are buried. Second, it exhausts the public. Because once the shine machine really gets moving, ordinary people are no longer being asked to judge performance. They are being asked to judge presentation. And presentation is a much easier contest to rig. A polished photograph will beat an audit in the public imagination 9 times out of 10. A ribbon cutting will outrun a body count if the public is tired enough. A smiling quote in a well-designed newsletter can do more damage to accountability than a shouted lie at a podium, because shouted lies at least have the decency to sound unstable. Polished lies sound employable. That is why I call it a machine, because it has parts. It has intake, scandal, failure, debt, injury, embarrassment, neglect, the kind of institutional rot that never becomes cinematic enough to hold the news for longer than a weather segment. Then it has processing, strategic silence, careful language, mutual praise, selective deletion, the disappearance of old websites, the rephrasing of ugly facts into manageable abstractions, the social choreography required to make sure the right people keep endorsing each other in the right order. Then it has output, a cleaned name, a polished resume, a new title, a fresh announcement, a leadership profile, a celebratory luncheon, a board seat, a campaign, a foundation, a community impact award, a panel discussion, a smiling photo under the right banner. That is the shine machine. It does not erase the past. It outpaces it. It does not have to deny what happened. It only has to make sure something brighter is always in front of it. That is why people buy it. Not because they are stupid, because they are tired. Because hope is lighter to carry than a ledger. Because the polished version asks less of them than memory does. Because the ribbon cutting is easier than the audit. Because the award photo is simpler than the file. Because at a certain point, continuing to hold the unpolished truth starts costing more socially than accepting the polished lie. That is how the machine dirties resistance. The person who remembers too clearly starts sounding negative. The witness starts sounding bitter. The person who keeps asking the plain question starts sounding rude. And once that happens, the county no longer has to win the argument. It only has to make memory feel impolite. That is why I keep coming back to the same question. Who paid for this shine? Not metaphorically. Who shut up? Who got blamed? Who got left out? Who got buried in process? Who got called difficult? Who got told not to make it public? Who got reclassified, renamed, narrowed, softened, delayed, or socially taxed so the polished version could survive? That is how you audit the machine. Not by admiring the glow, by checking the shadows. Because every cleaned up reputation leaves one. And if you follow that shadow long enough in Hunt County, it almost always lands on the same kinds of people. The unconnected, the undertitled, the dead, the grieving, the broke, the witnesses. The people naive enough to think truth would matter more than presentation if they just kept telling it clearly. That is who pays for the shine. Not because they deserve to, because this county has learned that if somebody has to leave the room carrying the bruise, it might as well be the person least capable of billing it back. By the time the shine machine finishes with the county, the damage no longer looks like damage. It looks like leadership. That is the real trick, not that bad people survive. Bad people survive everywhere, not that institutions fail. Institutions fail as naturally as men sweat in August. The trick is that here, failure does not merely get excused. It gets repackaged. It gets washed through enough boards, banquets, committee seats, civic rituals, reassuring statements, strategic silences, and smiling photographs that the public is eventually asked to accept the polished version as the real one. The bruise remains. The bill remains. The body remains. The silence remains. But the face on the brochure changes, and suddenly everyone is supposed to clap for the recovery of someone who never really had to survive the wound in the first place. That is why this matters. Because the shine machine is not just about image. It is about memory control. It tells the county who gets remembered as a builder, who gets remembered as a problem, and who gets forgotten entirely once their usefulness to the narrative expires. It decides whose failure becomes experience, whose silence becomes professionalism, whose harm becomes complexity, and whose insistence on the plain truth gets recast as bitterness, instability, or bad manners. That is not public relations, that is social editing. And once you see it, you begin to understand something worse than corruption. Hunt County does not merely produce failure, it produces approved versions of failure that can still win awards. That is how the same names keep rising. That is how the same networks keep smiling. That is how the same institutions keep asking for trust after spending years teaching the public exactly why trust should come armed. Which means the only real defense is memory that refuses to be polished for them. Memory that remembers the wound before the ribbon cutting. Memory that remembers the file before the feature spread. Memory that remembers the body before the plaque. Memory that keeps asking, every time a new glow-up rolls into town with a handshake and a photographer, what did this shine cost, and who paid for it? My name is Cass Wakefield, and this is the Hunt County Signal. If there is a person, an institution, or a local glow-up in Hunt County that never quite sat right with you, leave it in the comments. Because around here, not every clean reputation is clean. Some of them were just washed better.